The German U-boat campaign during the Second World War was not merely a military effort. It was a brutal, strategic siege that brought Great Britain closer to collapse than any other single factor of the German war machine. Imagine a world plunged into darkness, where the only lifeline, the Atlantic supply convoys, was hunted relentlessly by unseen predators. These predators were the U-boats, and their actions rewrote the rules of naval warfare, almost succeeding in their mission of economic strangulation. But what was the true, grinding reality of life aboard one of these submerged steel coffins? What kind of existence was traded for the chance to wage total war on the high seas? We're about to dive deep into that brutal, claustrophobic world through the eyes of one young man whose choices led him into the darkest corners of the Atlantic conflict. Meet Hans Fischer, a young German whose story is typical of thousands who served beneath the waves. Born near Lübeck in northern Germany, Hans had an almost inherent, natural fascination with the sea. This was not the call of a peaceful horizon, but a yearning for the power and danger inherent in maritime service. When the global conflict erupted in 1939, Hans was only 17, employed diligently as an apprentice mechanic. His mechanical education was a solid foundation, but the war promised a dramatic, terrifying acceleration of his life. By 1941, the time for technical training was over, and Hans faced a profound and life-altering choice. His options were stark and unforgiving. He could passively wait for an inevitable conscription notice from the Wehrmacht, which would almost certainly send him to the brutal, freezing hellscape of the Eastern Front in Russia, a destiny that held little appeal and immense risk of death by freezing or combat. Or he could take control of his fate, assert his will, and enlist himself in a service of his choosing. The decision was clear. He chose the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, believing that the freezing conditions of the land war were less appealing than the dangers of the sea. Once committed to the Navy, he was sent directly to basic training, and with a mix of reckless youthful optimism and patriotic fervor, he did the unthinkable. He volunteered for submarine service. Even now, Hans couldn't fully articulate the deep-seated impulse that drove him to sign up for a job whose risks were known to be astronomical. It was a potent combination of patriotism, a desperate desire for status within the wartime society, and the simple, blinding belief of youthful optimism that he would be one of the lucky ones. Hans was in excellent physical condition, and critically, his extensive experience as a mechanic made him a prime candidate for the specialized demands of U-boat service. His initial 3 months of basic training were conducted at the strategic port of Kiel. The discipline was notoriously strict, weeding out any who lacked the mental fortitude. But Hans adapted quickly. He began learning the intricate, unforgiving realities of life aboard a submarine, honing his nascent skills on a small Type II C coastal patrol sub, a tiny vessel designed for operations close to shore. Hans proved adept at adapting to the cramped life below the surface, graduating successfully from his training and earning his assignment to a real combat vessel. But the moment Hans stepped aboard his first assigned boat, U-134, the scale of the challenge and the danger multiplied exponentially. Hans's new home, U-134, was a Type VII C U-boat, the iconic model known throughout the Kriegsmarine as the true workhorse of the fleet. This designation was well-earned. These boats were produced in staggering numbers, with 568 built between 1938 and 1944. The Type VII C was an evolution of the Type VII B, a slightly larger. Hans was responsible for the continuous maintenance of the twin diesel engines, which could generate a combined 3,200 horsepower, the raw power needed for rapid movement on the surface. When submerged, the U-boat switched to its quieter, battery-powered electric motors. With the boat fully provisioned, U-134 departed from its designated port in occupied Norway. heading into the perilous vastness of the North Atlantic to begin its mission, hunting Allied shipping convoys. The Type VII C had a shorter operational range compared to later designs like the Type IX C, which meant its individual patrols were shorter in duration. This slightly limited the boat's overall combat effectiveness, but offered a small, brief relief for the crew, knowing their ordeal would not stretch out for endless weeks. However, it was immediately after they were underway that the cold, hard psychological reality of the mission slammed into Hans. He came to a startling, depressing realization that resonated with every man aboard. Serving aboard a U-boat was quite possibly the most miserable way to spend the war. The question becomes, can you imagine being permanently trapped with 48 other men in a confined steel tube for weeks on end? That was the reality. Personal space and privacy were not just scarce, they were utterly distant memories. Space was the ultimate premium, and every single corner of the vessel, from the bilges to the torpedo room, was jammed with supplies and specialized equipment. Consequently, crew comfort was a foreign concept, a luxury forfeited the moment the hatch slammed shut. Since there was no dedicated sleeping area, the men slept wherever a body could fit, which included the cramped confines of the engine room and the storage areas of the torpedo room. There were simply not enough bunks for the entire crew, necessitating the grueling practice of hot bunking. This meant men shared a bunk and slept in continuous shifts. Under standard operating procedures, the crew worked in rigorous 8-hour shifts, ensuring constant rotation of duty and rest. Only the captain had a semblance of privacy. A single bunk separated from the common area by a flimsy plywood screen or a fabric curtain. Beyond the sheer crowding, the physical conditions were torturous. The 2 diesel engines that powered the sub on the surface generated an immense amount of heat, which the crew struggled to vent unless the boat was fully surfaced. During prolonged dives, the temperatures inside the claustrophobic space would skyrocket. In the engine room, where Hans was stationed, temperatures could easily climb well over 38 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Compounding Hans's misery, he and the rest of the engine crew were continuously inhaling diesel fumes, a toxic mixture that only added to the sheer wretchedness of the air quality. And as the voyage continued, the misery extended even beyond heat and fumes. It touched upon the most basic human need: hygiene. Here is a fact that defies comprehension. There were no bathing facilities whatsoever on board U-134. The concept of a dedicated area for showering was simply deemed non-essential, a frivolous waste of space and resources. The men were given a strict ration of half a bucket of water per day, and that entire amount was solely for drinking. Washing was not possible, which meant clothes and skin were quickly coated in a sticky layer of oil, grease, and sweat. As a result, the boat rapidly developed a stench that defied description. Though they were issued deodorant to attempt to keep the smell at bay, it was a futile gesture that did very little to cut through the pervasive odor of bodies and petroleum. The entire crew of nearly 50 men had to share only one toilet. Furthermore, if washing was out of the question, shaving was an utter impossibility. It was not long before every man aboard sported a messy, scraggly beard, adding to the general sense of disarray. Despite these degrading conditions, Hans performed his duty. When his shift in the hot, fume-filled engine room was complete, it was time to eat his daily ration. Food was stored everywhere, tucked into every possible crevice around the ship. More than once, Hans has had to duck out of the way of smoked sausages hanging from the ceiling pipes. Yet, no matter what Hans ate, from bread to meat, it all shared the same dominant metallic taste: diesel fuel. The pervasive fumes were so thorough and acrid that they infused everything on the boat with the flavor of refined petroleum. Occasionally, there was a brief moment of reprieve. The U-boat would spend some time at the surface, where a crew of sailors would use binoculars and the raised periscope to search the horizon for enemy ships, while also scanning for patrolling aircraft. Hans isn't part of these outdoor groups, but the cramped interior of the sub felt momentarily less suffocating. With the hatch open, there's at least the suggestion of a breeze. Though it was probably Hans's imagination, he reveled in the thought of a breath of fresh air. Life aboard U-134 was defined by routine, cramped, hot, and filthy. The simplest daily routines were a constant struggle, and every waking moment was a reminder of the unforgiving nature of life beneath the waves. But then, the routine shattered. How does a steel tube the size of a train car survive when the ocean itself becomes a hunting ground? Suddenly, the alert siren screamed. The lookout party outside rushed in, slamming the hatch shut. Through the chaotic shouts, Hans heard the chilling words. An enemy destroyer had been spotted on the horizon, rapidly approaching on an intercept course. The captain's order rang out. Crash dive! This was the ultimate emergency procedure, requiring U-134 to sink as quickly and deeply as possible. The ballast tanks flooded, and the boat began to drop rapidly. Then, silence. The diesel engines were cut immediately to minimize noise and prevent detection by sonar. This was the terrifying reality. Hans sweated more than ever, acutely aware that an enemy warship was actively hunting him down, ready to unleash a barrage of depth charges that could send the entire crew to the bottom. The Type VII C had a theoretical crush depth of 220 meters, around 720 feet, a psychological limit they prayed they would never reach. Time stretched into an intolerable eternity. Furthermore, another looming problem began to creep through the ship. Air quality. Trapped beneath the waves, carbon dioxide levels rise quickly. Concentrations of just 2.5% could impair cognitive function. And despite alkaline cartridges and oxygen tanks, the absolute maximum time the sub could remain submerged was only about 72 hours. While the clock ticked down on their oxygen supply, Hans and the men not actively needed stood by, waiting, bracing for the inevitable, either the order to surface or the terrible rumble of the first depth charge. They were encouraged to go to sleep, as the resting body consumes less oxygen. But few men could actually find slumber under such profound psychological pressure. Miraculously, neither event occurred. After an intolerable, agonizing amount of waiting, the captain slowly and cautiously raised the boat. Finding the hunting destroyer gone, the U-134 slowly slipped away. Hans resumed his grueling routine. Though his patrol was ultimately unsuccessful in finding more ships, he survived. After finally pulling into port, he enjoyed a brief shore leave, a chance to shower, shave, and eat non-petrochemical-flavored food, before returning for another tour. Hans Fischer was one of the lucky few. He went on to complete 3 more patrols, and made it to the war's end, one of fewer than 10,000 men to survive. The cost was terrible. Roughly 3/4 of the entire German U-boat fleet and its crews were sent to the bottom of the ocean. Hans was one of the minority who made it home. Though he considered writing a book about his experience, Hans ultimately decided against it, choosing not to relive what he considered one of the most wretched and miserable periods of the Second World War. The personal accounts of men like Hans Fischer provide a crucial window into the extreme conditions and extraordinary courage demanded by naval warfare. If you'd like to experience commanding these iconic warships without the misery Hans endured, you're in luck. If you were captivated by this deep dive into Hans Fischer's story, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more compelling historical videos, and share this with a friend. We bring history to life through animation and incredible storytelling to make it more engaging and entertaining. Our content is always based on the work of respected historians, and you can see our references listed on the screen now. Stay tuned for our next episode.